Dear learners, welcome to video lecture series 11 for BA first semester Political Science paper Introduction to the Political Theory. I am Dr. Deepak Kumar Kashyap, Assistant Professor at Pandit Sundalal Sarma Open University. Today we will discuss in the evolution of political science as a discipline. Scholars have adopted different approaches to understand political processes and institutions. After the dominance of behavioralism in the mid 20th century, many scholars began to question whether political science was becoming too technical and disconnected from real social problems. This criticism eventually led to the emergence of post behavioralism. In this lecture, we will understand the meaning, background, principles, characteristics, importance, and criticism of post behavioralism.
About the introduction of the post-behavioralism, basically we saw the post-behavioralism have the third phase of political theory. First, we can study the traditional approach, second, the behavioral approach, and the third approach is the post-behavioral approach. We can see over the course of 20th century, it moved through several distinct methodological phases and each building on and reacting to what come before. By the mid-century, the behavioral approach had come to dominate the discipline, promising scientific rigor and objective analysis. But after the late 1960s, a gross choice of scholars began to challenge behavioralism's blind spots. They questioning whether political science was fulfilling its responsibility to society and is doing so. They set the stage for a new intellectual movement that is called post-behavioralism. Basically, talk about the background of post-behavioralism. And before understanding post-behavioralism, it is essential to grasp what it was reacting against. How post-behavioralism is introduced in the concept of political theory. Behavioralism emerged in 1940s and 1950s as a self-conscious effort to transform political science into a rigorous empirical science modeled on the natural science. If we talk about the behavioralism, the behavioralism have the four mainly the features. First, it is based on the empirical data. Second, it is based on the quantification. Third, it is based on the value neutrality. And the fourth, it used in a systematic method. So these methods were opposed by the various theories, and one of the theory is the post-behavioralism. In the late 1960s was a time of profound social upheaval. Civil rights marches, anti-war protests, and demands for social justice were reshaping American society. Against this backdrop, a growing number of political scientists felt that their discipline was failing the movement. Then, the post-behavioralism emerged as a direct intellectual reaction to this crisis of relevance. It did not seek to abandon scientific method entirely, but it insists that those methods must serve human needs and social justice, not merely academic prestige. The three things when the post-behavioralism is taking place. First, late 1960s accelerated through the 1970s. Then, what are the reasons why post-behavioralism is emerged? The Answer is the crisis of relevance in the face of urgent social and political challenges. And third, how post-behavioralism is emerged by calling for values, actions, and social responsibility in scholarship. If we talk about who give the concept of post-behavioralism, the main key proponent is the David Easton. David Easton also propounded the theory of behavioralism, but this time David Easton, who is known for American Canadian political scientist and also the president of IPSA, Indian Political Science Association. So basically, if we talk about the David Easton, a leading political scientist of the 20th century, Easton had himself been respected within the behavioral tradition, which give his critique exceptional credibility and weight. In his 1969 presidential address to the American Political Science Association, Easton delivered a landmark challenge to the discipline. He argued that the political science had become too absorbed in technical methods at the expense of social purpose. His call to action was direct research must be socially relevant, value consciousness, and action oriented. Then he propound the concept of post-behavioralism. Basically, if know what is post-behavioralism, the first question arises in our mind that what is the post-behavioralism? How? Basically, the post-behavioralism is the best understood as a reform movement within political science. Not a complete rejection of what came before, but a deliberate correction of its excesses. It accepts the value of empirical and scientific method, but insists that such method must be guided by a commitment to social responsibility. Basically, the post-behavioralism have mainly three features. First, it is based on scientific analysis. Second, it is based on social responsibility. And the third, it is based on the problem solving focus. If we talk about the scientific analysis in postmodernism, it retains the empirical tools developed during the behavioral era, systematic observation, data collection, and rigorous methodology. Second, social responsibility. Postmoralism insists that the scholarship must serve the public good and addressing real inequalities, injustice, and political challenges facing society. And third is the problem solving focus. The post-behavioralism is basically a mechanism to know the how the society have the problem, how we can solve through various process. It orients research toward the resolution of genuine political and social problems, not just the satisfaction of academic curiosity. If we talk about the five core principles, the first core principle of post-behavioralism is relevance. Second is action contributed to social change. Third is the social responsibility. Fourth is value orientation. And fifth is the problem solving approach. We can discuss it in later slides. First, if we talk about the principle which is based on post-behavioralism, that is the relevance. At the heart of post-behavioralism is a demand for relevance. Political scientists, post-behavioralists argued that they must choose their research question based not only on methodological tractability but on social and political urgencies. A discipline that can produce elegant statistical model of electoral behavior but has nothing to say about systematic racism, poverty, or war has failed in its most basic obligation. Relevance means the theory and research must connected to the lived reality of political actors, citizens, and society. The research topic must reflect pressing social and political problems. Second, theoretical framework must be tested against real world outcomes. And third, academic work should be accessible and useful beyond the university. The second principle is action. Post-behavioralism insists that the knowledge must not remain confined to academic journals, but scholars bear a responsibility to act on what they know, to engage with policymakers, communities, and institutions to drive a meaningful change. The principle reflects a broader philosophical commitment that the purpose of studying politics is ultimately to improve political life. An action orientation does not compromise the scholarly integrity it fulfills. We talk about if talk about the actions, there are the three main things. First is the policy engagement, second is the public scholarship, and third is the institutional reform. If we talk about the third principle of post-behavioralism is the value orientation. One of the most philosophical significant departs from behavioralism was post-behavioralism's embraces of values. Behavioralist has prized value neutrality, the idea that science must be free from moral or normative commitment, but the post-behavioralist challenged his position head on. The post-behavioral position that values are not contamination of political science, they are its foundation. And every choice of research topic, every interpretation of data that reflect underlying normative commitment, acknowledging this honestly is more rigorous than pretending to a neutrality that does not exist. What this means in practice. How we practice value orientation that the scholars openly acknowledge their normative assumptions and commitment. Thus, second, ethical consideration and integrated into research design and interpretation. Third, questions of justice, equalities, and rights are treated as legitimate scholarly concern. And fourth, the normative theory and empirical analysis are treated as a complementary, not opposed. The fourth principle of post-behavioralism is integration of method. It talks about rather than a rejecting behavioralism entirely, postmodern behavioralism sought a synthesis. It argued that the political science is most powerful when it draws on both normative and empirical tradition, combining the analytical depth of traditional political philosophy with the methodologic rigor of behavioral science. It talks about the traditional oblique normative, behavioral oblique empirical, and post behavioral synthesis. If we talk about the traditional, in traditional, it talk about the philosophical reasoning, historical analysis, institutional study, and value-based inquiry into what political life is ought to be. In behavioral approach, the data collection, statistical modeling, comparative methods, and systematic observation how politics actually works. And the post-behavioral synthesis, it combines the merits of traditional and behavioral approaches. RES he integrated an approach that uses empirical tools in service of normative goals, rigorous in method, and purposeful in aim. So, this methodological pluralism remains one of the post behavioralism most enduring legacies. It gives scholars permission to use whatever tools best serve the research question rather than being constructed by ideological commitment to a single methodology. If we talk about the importance of the post-behavioralism, the post-behavioralism why matter in present time? Because it fundamentally expanded the scope of what political science could and should do. It rescued the discipline from a dangerous trip towards methodological narcissism and the tendency to value technique over substance. If we talk about the post the first its relevance importance insisting on engagement with real political problems. Post-behavioralism reconnected political science to the world it meant to study and serve. The second importance is elevated ethical standard. The movement made it legitimate, even obligatory for scholars to consider the moral and ethical implications of their research and finding. And the third importance is it promoted interdisciplinary. Basically, it focused the problem focused medical science considerably. If we talk about the criticism of post-behavioralism, that the first problem is the subjectivity problem. The critics argue that by explicitly incorporating values into research, post-behavioralism risks undermining the scientific credibility of political science. When scholars are openly committed to particular normative outcomes, can their findings still be trusted as impartial? Second, the balance challenge. Even sympathetic scholars acknowledge the difficulty balancing scientific rigor with value judgment in practice. How does one maintain methodological standard while simultaneously pursuing a normative agenda? The post-behavioral literature has not always provided satisfactory answer. The first is the problem is the risk of confirmation bias when values guide interpretation. Second, difficulties defining whose values should guide research agenda. And third, potential fragmentation of a shared discipline standard. So this type of criticism faced by the behavioralism, if we talk about the comparison between the behavioralism and post-behavioralism, because it is important, in previous lectures I talked about the behavioralism, and this slide we can talk about the post behavioralism. So the comparison between both is very important because it can define how it is work in present time and what is the relevance of post behavioralism in present time. Why behavior? So basically, if we talk about the behavioralism basically focus on scientific methods and techniques, where post-behavioralism focus on relevance and social purpose. Second, behavioralism focus on value neutral and it is strict separation of fact and values, where post-behavioralism is value oriented and values are acknowledged and integrated. Third, behavioralism is pure research for knowledge accumulation, where post-behavioralism is focused on action-oriented scholarship and to social change. Fourth, behavioralism is emphasis on quantification and empirical data, where post-behavioralism is emphasis on synthesis of normative and empirical analysis. Fifth, behavioralism, according to behavioralism, political science is natural science, where post-behavioralism, political science as a human and social science. Six, where behavioralism detachment from contemporary social problem, where post-behavioralism is direct engagement with the real political challenges. If we talk about the what is the impact on modern political science of post-behavioralism, the first is public policy studies. Second, the political development. Third, the normative political theory. And fourth, the civic engagement research. Basically, the post-behavioral movement influence on contemporary political science because it has been deep and lasting. It catalyzing the emergence of several subfields and research traditions that now sit at the heart of the discipline. If we talk about the conclusion, basically the post-behavioralism, which is stands as one of the most important self-corrective movement in the history of political science, where it did not abandon the discipline's aspiration to reserve its demand that reserve be placed in the service of human needs. Basically, we can say that in conclusion, the post behavioralism reminds us that the most rigorous political science is not the most detached, it is the most engaged with the world as it truly is, and it as ought to be. And finally, the suggested reading book list. Thank you. Thank you so much.